My parents disowned me from my stepbrother. Now that he's ruined their lives, they expect me to save them. I always knew I wasn't their priority. I just didn't realize how little I actually mattered to them until much later in life. Looking back, the signs were everywhere. The small slights, the dismissive comments, the way my needs were always framed as burdens while Ethan's were treated as life and death necessities. But when you grow up in that kind of environment, it doesn't hit you all at once. It builds slowly, over years, like water wearing down stone. I was 16 when my mom remarried. My biological father had been out of the picture for as long as I could remember. One of those guys who started a family and then realized he didn't actually want one. He vanished before I was old enough to form real memories of him, and my mom never talked about him. In her mind, he didn't exist. For a long time, it was just the two of us. Things weren't perfect, but they were manageable. We had our struggles, money was tight, and she worked constantly, but at least I felt like I belonged in my own home. That changed when she met my stepdad. He was by all appearances the perfect guy, charming, well-off, and the kind of man who made people feel comfortable around him. But the real game changer was Ethan, his golden child. Ethan was a year older than me, and from the second he walked into our lives, it became clear where I stood. He wasn't just a new addition to the family, he became the family. It was subtle at first. My mom and stepdad didn't outright say he was the favorite. They just acted like he was. He had this effortless way of pulling people in, of making them like him. He was outgoing, confident, and had a way of twisting situations so that he always came out looking good. If he got in trouble, it was a misunderstanding. If I so much as frowned in the wrong direction, I was being difficult. They never said it outright, but the message was clear. Ethan was important. I was there. That first year was the beginning of my slow erasure from my own home. It started with the little things. Dinners that used to be just me and my mom turned into conversations about Ethan's accomplishments, his soccer games, his straight-A report cards, his plans for the future. My mom, who used to at least pretend to care about what was going on in my life, now only asked about my day as an afterthought. Holidays became a showcase for Ethan. His gifts were always better, more expensive. He got the latest gadgets, the nicest clothes. I got things that felt more like obligations. Cheap, impersonal gifts that screamed, I didn't know what to get you, so I just grabbed something on sale. When my 17th birthday rolled around, I got a used car. It was barely running, the kind of thing that needed constant repairs just to stay functional. But I was grateful. At least I had something. Ethan's 18th birthday came 3 months later. He got a brand new Mustang. I remember staring at it in the driveway, my stomach twisting. It wasn't even jealousy. I had long since stopped expecting fairness. It was the blatancy of it, the way my stepdad beamed with pride, the way my mom gushed about how much Ethan deserved it. Like he had somehow earned a new sports car, while I was expected to make do with a machine that barely got me from point A to point B. It was one thing to suspect you weren't as valued. It was another to have it confirmed in ways that were impossible to ignore. But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was the way they made me feel guilty for wanting even the bare minimum. When it came time to apply for college, I knew I was on my own. I had spent the last 2 years working, juggling school, homework, and part-time jobs because I understood early on that if I wanted something, I had to get it myself. Ethan, on the other hand, never had to lift a finger. His tuition was fully covered. Not just tuition, his entire college experience was financed from his apartment to his spending money. Meanwhile, when I asked if they could help with just tuition, my mom sighed like I had asked for something extravagant. My stepdad told me I needed to learn responsibility and that expecting financial help was selfish. I don't think I've ever felt smaller than I did in that moment. It was so absurd that I almost laughed. My entire childhood, I had been responsible. I had worked, saved, planned, but responsibility only seemed to be a requirement for me. Ethan never had to prove anything. He just was, and that was enough. It was the first time I truly understood that no matter what I did, it wouldn't change anything. They weren't waiting for me to become someone worthy of their support. They had already decided that I wasn't. By the time I got my first job offer, I had emotionally checked out of my family. It wasn't even intentional. I just stopped trying. I didn't come home for visits as often. When I did, I barely spoke unless spoken to. Conversations felt forced, like I was interacting with distant relatives rather than the people who were supposed to raise me. They noticed, but only in the way that people notice a minor inconvenience. When I told them I had been offered a position in another city, my mom barely reacted. My stepdad nodded and made some comment about how it was good to be independent. The only person who seemed to care was Ethan, and not in a good way. He failed out of college around the same time. Too much partying, too little effort. The golden child had cracked under the weight of his own entitlement. My mom cried for days. My stepdad was devastated. They rallied around him, took out a second mortgage to help him get back on his feet. And then, somehow, it became my fault. They said that if I had been around more, maybe I could have guided him. Maybe he wouldn't have lost his way. Maybe I should have been the one to set an example. That was the moment I knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that I was done. The last time I went home, my bedroom was gone. It wasn't even gradual. I walked in expecting to see my things, and instead, I found an empty space, cleared out, repainted, repurposed for Ethan. My belongings had been stuffed into the garage like an afterthought. That was it for me. That was the moment I stopped hoping. I didn't fight. I didn't argue. I just packed my things, walked out, and never looked back. I erased them from my life completely, blocked their numbers, changed mine. To them, I'd always been an afterthought. So I made sure that, from that moment on, they were nothing to me. When I cut them off, I never looked back. Not once. At first, there were a few weak attempts to reach out. A half-hearted text from my mom here and there. A single email from my stepdad that was so generic, it could have been copy-pasted from a parenting advice blog. I ignored them all. I had spent too many years being the afterthought, the backup plan, the one who was expected to make do while Ethan got everything handed to him. I had no interest in playing that role for a second longer. The thing about growing up as a second choice is that you eventually start to believe that's all you are. It took time, years really, to undo that mindset. But once I was free from them, once I was building my own life without their dismissive words hanging over me, I realized something important. I was never the problem. I had spent my entire childhood thinking if I was just better, smarter, stronger, more like Ethan, then maybe they'd finally see me. Maybe I'd be worthy of their attention, their love, their time. But that was the lie they fed me to keep me scrambling for scraps. They never wanted me to succeed. Not really, because my success meant they had to face the reality that I didn't need them. And for years, I proved it. I worked my ass off. I built my career from the ground up. I didn't have anyone to fall back on. No safety net like Ethan had. If I failed, there was no second mortgage being taken out to bail me out. No emergency fund waiting for me to screw up. So I didn't screw up. I climbed my way up, made something of myself, and eventually, I found happiness, real happiness. Not the kind that came from chasing after people who would never choose me, but the kind that came from knowing I was finally free. I was engaged to an incredible man who treated me with respect, something I had never been given in my own home. I owned my own house, a place that was mine, where no one could ever walk in and decide I didn't belong. I had real friends, people who didn't view me as an accessory to someone else's life. For the first time, I was whole, and then the phone calls started. At first, I ignored them. The number was familiar, but I refused to let curiosity get the better of me. I let them go to voicemail, assuming it was just another half-hearted attempt at reconnecting now that I was successful. But they kept coming, one after another. When I finally listened, I was expecting something pathetic, maybe an emotional guilt trip from my mom, a desperate plea for family unity now that I was doing well. I wasn't expecting panic. She sounded frantic. Her voice shook in a way I had never heard before. My stepdad left a message, too short, clipped, as if he had swallowed his pride just long enough to ask for my help. It was all about Ethan. Something had happened. They wouldn't say what, only that it was serious and that they needed me to call them back immediately. I almost deleted the message without a second thought. But then, on a whim, I started looking for local news on the internet. And there it was, his mugshot. I stared at the screen for a long time, barely processing the words in the article. Ethan had been arrested for fraud. Not just any fraud, massive fraud. The kind that ruins lives. He had spent the past few years scamming people, draining their bank accounts, setting up fake investments, and taking off with the money. He had left a trail of financial ruin behind him, and now it had caught up to him. My parents had done exactly what they had always done, rushed to his defense. They had spent everything they had trying to fix his mistakes. They had sold their house to cover his legal fees. They had drained their savings trying to get him out of trouble. And now they had nothing. The golden child had finally fallen, and they were turning to the backup plan to save them. I can't describe what I felt in that moment. It wasn't happiness, not really. It wasn't relief either. It was something colder, a quiet, undeniable confirmation. After years of being told I wasn't enough, that I was selfish for wanting even a fraction of the attention Ethan got, that I needed to understand why he deserved more than me. This was what they had to show for it. They had bet everything on him, and they had lost. It wasn't that I wanted them to suffer. I wasn't some vengeful person hoping to see them destroyed. But I was done pretending that they had ever cared about me in the way parents are supposed to. I didn't need their apology. I didn't need to hear them say they were wrong. I had already won in the only way that mattered. I had built a life where their opinions, their neglect, their blatant favoritism, none of it meant anything anymore. They had spent decades choosing Ethan over me. And now, when everything had crumbled around them, they expected me to step in and fix it. The same way they had expected me to guide him before. The same way they had always expected me to be responsible while he got to make mistake after mistake. But I had no intention of cleaning up their mess. I let them sit with their desperation for a while. I ignored a few more calls. I let them stew in the consequences of their choices. Eventually, I agreed to meet them just once. Not because I owe them anything, but because I wanted to see the look in their eyes when they realized just how wrong they had been. I didn't go to their tiny, run-down apartment. I didn't let them set the terms. I picked a cafe near my house, a place that screamed success, the kind of place they would have once looked down on as too fancy. When I walked in, they barely recognized me at first. My mom looked exhausted. My stepdad had aged 10 years in half the time. They weren't the confident, dismissive people I remembered. They looked like people who had been humbled. But not enough, because the first thing out of my mother's mouth wasn't an apology. It was a plea. She wanted me to help them. Not just financially, though that was part of it. She wanted me to be there for Ethan, to help him through this. She spoke as if nothing had happened, as if I was still some dutiful child waiting for a scrap of their attention. I let her talk, let them both go on about family and forgiveness, and how they had made mistakes but still needed me. And when they were done, when they had poured out every last ounce of desperation they had left, I made one thing clear. I wasn't their child anymore. I wasn't their backup plan. And whatever love I had once had for them, it died the day they replaced me with Ethan. I stood up. I paid for my coffee. And I walked away without looking back. I moved on. Truly, completely, fully moved on. After cutting my parents off for good, I never gave them another thought. There was no lingering guilt, no hesitation, no moments of wondering if I'd made the right choice. No more fighting to be seen. No more playing the role of the responsible one, while Ethan spiraled into chaos with an army of enablers at his back. No more struggling to convince myself that I had a family when, in reality, I had never really had one. And it was incredible. I thrived in my career, worked my way up, and built something real. My name became one that people respected in my industry. I wasn't Ethan's shadow anymore. I was my own person, standing firmly in my own success. My relationship flourished. I got married to an incredible man, someone who chose me every single day, not out of obligation or convenience, but because he loved me for who I was. He saw me in a way my parents never had. We traveled. We built a home together. We had friends who felt more like family than the people I had grown up with ever did. For years, my old life barely crossed my mind, until one random morning when I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, scrolling through the news on my phone, and Ethan's name appeared on my screen. At first, I thought I had imagined it. Maybe it was just an old story resurfacing, some article about his arrest from years ago. But as I clicked on the first headline, my stomach sank. Ethan wasn't just in prison anymore. He was staying there. For a long time. It turned out, the fraud case that originally landed him in trouble was just the beginning. At the time of his arrest, my parents had done everything they could to shield him. They sold their house, drained their savings, and hired the best lawyers they could afford, all to try and lessen his sentence. They pleaded, bargained, pulled every string they had left. And for a while it worked. He got out on bail. But Ethan was Ethan. And Ethan couldn't help himself. Instead of laying low, instead of trying to rebuild, he doubled down on being Ethan. He went right back to doing what he did best: lying, stealing, manipulating. Except this time, he wasn't just running simple scams. This time, he got involved with people who were far worse than him. Shady business deals, fraud schemes that reached international levels. By the time he got caught again, it wasn't just for financial crimes. The details were messy, too messy for a simple news article to lay out completely. But the general consensus was clear. Ethan wasn't getting out of this one. He wasn't looking at a slap on the wrist. He wasn't getting a reduced sentence because of good behavior or strong legal defense. He was looking at decades behind bars. And this time, there was no money left to save him. No golden parachute. No second mortgage to take out. No retirement fund to drain. My parents had nothing left to give. And for the first time in his life, Ethan had to face the consequences of his own actions. I sat there, rereading the article over and over, waiting for something, anything, to spark inside me. But there was nothing. No satisfaction. No sense of finally getting justice. No burning anger or quiet relief. Just nothing. Because the truth was, Ethan had never really mattered to me. Not beyond the role he played in my suffering. I had spent years hating him, wishing he would fail, wishing something, anything, would finally force my parents to see him for who he really was. But now that it had happened, I realized that Ethan had never been the real problem. He had always been this person. Selfish, entitled, manipulative. It was them, my parents, who had chosen to feed into it. They had made him into the monster he became. They had taught him that he would never face consequences, that he was special, untouchable. They had spent their entire lives building him up at the expense of everything: their money, their home, their dignity. Me. And now, in the end, all they had left was a prison-bound son and an empty life. Ethan had been their greatest investment, and he had bankrupted them. I didn't call them, didn't reach out, didn't care. I closed the article, finished my coffee, went about my day. And as I did, I realized something else, something final. For years, a small part of me had always wondered, what if they had been different? What if one day they finally saw me, chose me? That tiny, lingering question, the what if, had always been there, buried deep inside me, whether I admitted it or not. But now it was gone, because I finally knew the answer. They had never been capable of choosing me. They had been given every opportunity to do so, and they had always made the same decision. So why the hell would I waste another second of my life wondering about people who had never wondered about me? I wasn't free from them because of Ethan's downfall. I had been free from them for years. And that was all that mattered.